All right, well, welcome everybody to our first session on the book of Ruth. I hope that's why you're here, to study the book of Ruth. We had a great first session at 11 o'clock this morning, so I'm sure we will have a lot of fruitful conversation today. Just to remind us that we are in the midst of a 12-week study on the theme of grace, and we started with Jonah and had an exciting 4-week run through that book. And then we followed that up by studying Paul's letter to the Philippians.
You're going to have to go in your own car.
Turning back to the Old Testament, to the book of Ruth. So why don't I open us with prayer, and then we will get started. The Lord be with you.
Also with
you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we praise you for this new day and the opportunities that you've already given us throughout this day to share your love and to be the followers of Jesus that you've called us to be. Help us as we enter into this time of study and reflection and conversation to be open to the teaching and inspiration of your Holy Spirit, especially as we study this book of Ruth and learn more deeply your commitments of faithfulness and grace and mercy that you have shown to your people throughout the ages. And for that, we give you praise and we give you glory through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, well, I'm going to share my screen as usual and get us started. So throughout this 12-week study, we've sort of been building a definition of grace. And we started with the book of Jonah, focusing primarily on the kind of most basic definition of grace, God's undeserved and unearned favor and kindness that God demonstrated even to the horrible, awful Ninevites in the book of Jonah. Then we turned to Paul's letter to the Philippians and also turned the crystal a bit on the definition of grace and looked at grace more as God's enabling power that develops in us the character of Christ and enables us to live the life of the kingdom of God on this earth. Now we're going to kind of go in a slightly different direction, perhaps, as we think about grace. And I wanted to share with you this quote that is from a website that I go to frequently. It says, "Grace is the love of God shown to the unlovely, the peace of God given to the restless, the unmerited favor of God. A shorthand for what grace is: mercy, not merit. Mercy, not merit. Grace is the opposite of karma, which is all about getting what you deserve. Grace is getting what you don't deserve and not getting what you do deserve." So I think in some ways this definition or this understanding of grace may play into our discussions around the characters in the book of Ruth. So as we turn our attention to the book of Ruth, just a bit of history and background to get us oriented to what we're about to read. We don't know who the author is. It's another one of these books in the Old Testament that is a short story, a narrative that has no identifiable author. So we can't really say much about that. When was it written? Well, again, it's probably like the book of Jonah. It's describing events that happened at a certain period, but the final form of the book likely took shape much later, post-exile. Maybe 5th century, 4th century BC. And there's some reasons why we think that is the case, and we'll come back to those as we get into the book. What is the purpose of the book? And I think there's two primary purposes. One is going to be more important for us as we read this time than perhaps the other. But the first purpose is that it is clearly a bridge between the time of the judges and the time of the monarchy in the history of Israel. And if we look at the first verse, it says, in the days when judges ruled. And so the book starts clearly with the backdrop of the period of judges, which weren't kings. They were men and women that God raised up for a particular period of time to deal with issues in the community. And then usually something went wrong or they got killed, and then another judge would appear after a period of time. At the end of the book, we learned that Jesse, the descendant of Ruth, fathers David. The last word of the book is David, who of course will rise up to be the greatest king Israel will ever know. It's interesting that it sort of bypasses the whole saga of Saul completely, who was a failed king, and jumps right to David. But it starts with Judges and ends with David. So it's a bridge book between the Judges and the monarchy. It's also an apology or a defense, if you will, not a I'm sorry, but a defense for the inclusion of foreign wives. And why is that important? Well, if this was written after the exile or came into its final form after the exile, one of the major issues was what to do with all of these wives that the men of Israel had acquired while they were in a foreign land. And so in the ancient world, getting married, having children for the continuation of the family line and for labor and all sorts of good reasons, Israelite men married foreign women. They came back to the promised land, back to the land of Israel, and there was division about what to do with the foreign wives. Ezra and Nehemiah are in one camp, and they are advocating getting rid of the foreign wives and expelling them from the land. The book of Ruth clearly is making a case and making a defense for the inclusion of foreign wives, because Ruth herself is a Moabite who is married to Boaz, an Israelite, at the end of the book. So it's interesting. We picked up that theme more than once in the morning session. We'll see where we go today. The structure is very tight. There's an opening prologue where Naomi's family dies, and then a succession of 4 scenes. Naomi returning to Bethlehem with Ruth, Ruth gleaning with Boaz in the field, Ruth asking Boaz to redeem and marry her, and Boaz making arrangements for that redemption and marriage at the gate to the city. And then in conclusion, Naomi is blessed with a new family, sort of the reciprocation of what happens in the prologue, where she loses her family. It's inverted, and she is blessed with a new family in the conclusion. And then that blessing is extended through this brief genealogy throughout all generations. And as I said, the last word of the book is David. So the purpose clearly is to point the reader forward to the rise of David. But it's a very neatly structured, fairly tight structured book. So some general observations. God is not really mentioned by the narrator. It might come up once. The name the Lord is uttered by the characters in some of the dialogue. But unlike Jonah, if you were with us for Jonah, God is the primary actor in Jonah. God causes the waves to come. God causes the whale to swallow Jonah. God causes the Ninevites to repent. God is not one with a lot of agency, at least in terms of what is said by the narrator in this book. But clearly, the providence of God is the undercurrent through the whole story. It's just not as overt as it was in the book of Jonah. God's providence in the midst of the mundane, right? These are simple people going about their lives, harvest and famine time and harvest time. The relationships between family members, and yet God's providence works through that to bring about the lineage of David. So it's a powerful reminder of that. And then the significance of names. Names in the Old Testament play a pretty important role in many books, but in particular, the book of Ruth, the names really matter. So here's not an exhaustive list, but a pretty good list. The name Naomi means pleasantness or beautiful. Her husband, who dies, Elimelech, his name means my God is king. Their 2 sons, they're not going to make it very far because of their names. If you're reading this in the ancient world, Mahlon, it means sickness, and Kilion means failure. The two Moabite women, Orpah literally means back of the neck or stubbornness. Ruth means friendship, faithfulness, and Boaz means in him there is strength, or the strength of a redeemer, and that is the role that he will play in the story. So you get a sense of what these characters are going to go through by their names in the story. And then finally, there are some really important key words throughout the book. I want to mention one that shows up a lot in chapter 1. It's the Hebrew word shuv, which means to turn. It occurs 15 times in the book. 12 of those occurrences are in chapter 1. So in this relatively short chapter, 22 verses, this one word occurs 12 times, to turn. And this turning is on many levels. There's emotional turning, when Naomi, who is dealing with famine with her family, and then her family dies. Clearly, at the end of chapter 1, she is in a place of deep grief. There's geographical turning all throughout the chapter. They go from Bethlehem to Moab, back to Bethlehem. Spiritual turning, situational turning in terms of the circumstances, the situation in which people find themselves is quickly shifting throughout the story, and sort of moving back and forth. So this image of turning is going to be really important as we read through chapter 1 of Ruth. The last thing I'll say as we get into the book is that traditionally, if you have heard sermons on Ruth, you probably have heard sermons that sort of say we should all be more like Ruth, right? Faithful, obedient, loyal, and that's a very good way to read this story. But if this story is about grace and about redemption, who ultimately in the story is the recipient of that redemption and that grace? And I'll just kind of leave that there, because I think as we read through the story, different characters experience that in different ways throughout the narrative. All right, any questions or feedback on just those introductory comments before we jump into the text of Ruth chapter 1? You're all 100%, you're all on board? You're good.
I think
Ian,
Ruth
you're
was very
muted,
brave.
I'm sorry.
I went to the Blue Letter Bible and I actually read chapter 1 in what looked at the Hebrew, and I did not pick up the whole turn thing, which is interesting.
Yeah.
I found the chesed, the kindness, because that's a key word for me. And in fact, in your introduction, when you said a short definition of grace is mercy, not merit. Mercy is one of the interpretations of hesed,
Right.
As it applies to this. So,
well, as usual, Ian, you're ahead of the class. So now that's another key word, hesed, that we're definitely going to come back to for sure. But it's fun reading it in Hebrew, isn't it? Just to try to navigate through that. All right, well, let's jump into Ruth chapter 1.
Hey, Doug.
In these 22 verses. Was someone going to say something? Okay. So will someone
Sounded like
read
Joe.
verses 1 through 5?
I don't know who that is.
Go ahead, Kathy.
And
You're muted as well.
you're muted.
Oops, now I'm not.
There we go.
Okay. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a family in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, how do you say that?
However you'd like to say it is perfect.
Okay.
Amalek.
Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Oprah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband.
That's good. We'll stop there.
I do want to know how to say it, though.
Yeah, I've always said it Elimelech.
Elimelech. Oh, that sounds like a
Elimelech.
song.
Okay.
Yeah, Melech means
Like-
king
Yeah,
in
that's-
Hebrew,
Okay.
Melech. So it's God is king, or the strength of the king. And a little slip there. It's the name is Orpah. I've heard though that Oprah is her name is a misspelling of Orpah, but I don't know if that's true or not. But
Yeah.
yeah. So a couple thoughts here. You know, they're driven out of the land of Israel, out of Bethlehem, which again has significance because this is all about the lineage of David, which of course for Christians then becomes the lineage of the Messiah. So coming from Bethlehem is significant. But it's a time of famine, right? And elsewhere in the Bible, famine is part of sort of God's providence, right? That God uses these big movements in terms of weather and environmental conditions and so forth to move people around according to his will. But there's a bit of irony that it's Bethlehem, which means house of bread. Bethlehem means house of bread. And yet there's a famine, right? There's a famine in Bethlehem. And then, you know, this is pretty typical in these Old Testament books where we meet these characters and then very quickly things begin to happen, right? So like the book of Job, within the first 10 or 15 verses of Job, you know, his family has all died, right? And so we're very quickly thrust into the tragedy that has befallen this Israelite family. They're not in their land; they're in a foreign land, and the husband and 2 sons die, which is a crisis in the ancient world, right? To be a widow and then to have 2 daughters who are also widows. You have no means of support. Your whole social network has just been pulled out from under you. This is not just, you know, they don't have any food. This is now a legitimate economic and social crisis for them. Other thoughts on Naomi and her family as they sojourn into Moab?
Hey, Doug.
Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, just a question on the naming of the sons. It would seem to me you wouldn't have those names at birth.
Right.
Must have been given to them after they died or something, because that's who would name their son's sickness.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. No, that came up at our 11 o'clock session too. I think this is where we have to think, like with Jonah, there's an element of this being sort of like a parable, right? Where these characters, we don't know if they have historical antecedents or not, but they certainly at this stage of the development, they represent, you know, certain events and issues and so forth that have befallen the people of Israel and so forth. So yeah, I don't think most people are going to name their kids sickness and failure. Right?
I believe that this is the function of the rewrite. There is an old tale close to this that if it really happened after they came back to Jerusalem, the major prophets at the time were strongly against foreign wives being considered and treated as equal to Israelites.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I think this is the only instance in the Bible where we have a foreign wife playing a major role. a wife. It's key. David, they still took foreign wives throughout the ages and had multiple wives. So, but the naming, I think, is part of the rewrite. We want to set that character, so we give him this name.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Ian.
And if I could comment, this is a very, as you noticed when you read Ruth, and I read it, the entire book in about 3 different translations. It's a very short book. And you can imagine that this was a story that was told orally. And it was very common in the ancient world when you told a story orally that you had certain tropes you used to immediately communicate to your audience certain things. So the naming of the 2 boys as being disease and famine or whatever they were was an immediate indicator to the audience of what was to come.
Right.
So that I think is probably a part of this.
Yeah. And this book, there are 5 books of the Old Testament that are read as part of the various festivals and feast days in Israel, and Ruth is one of them. And it's read aloud during the Festival of Weeks, or what we call Pentecost, right? The 50th day after the first night of Passover. So these short stories, like Jonah, is another one that's read at a festival. As Ian said, were meant to be heard in their entirety, orally, kind of in one sitting.
I once questioned a rabbi on why Ruth was so strong in their culture. And he said she's a primary character in their belief.
Yeah.
And the fact that they read Ruth at their festivals and that, he says that she is considered by many a mother of the Israelite family. From then on, establishing David and then onward.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
And I was going to say, Doug, it's interesting that I did not know that about the book of Ruth, but I knew that about the book of Esther. So it's interesting that although there are very few books named after women in the Hebrew Bible, they're disproportionately represented in these festivals.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's good. Okay, so this is really the prologue, verses 1 through 6, or 1 through 5, this introduction that sets up the tragedy that has come upon Naomi and her family. So at the end of verse 5, we're left with 3 widows, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. So will someone pick up and read verse 6 through 14? 6 through 14. Go ahead, Ian.
okay. This is the RSV. Then Naomi started with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have been dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find a home, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say that I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her.
Thank you. Just notice the number of times in my translation, at least, the word return or turn happens, right? Return to the country of Moab. I'm returning to my land. Turn back, my daughters. You know, there's this tension here between where they're supposed to turn, where they're supposed to shuv. And at the end, Orpah shows affection towards her mother-in-law, but then the implication is she listens and goes back to her land. But Ruth, this very strong verb, clings to Naomi, right? This clinging. So there's a depth in the relationship already that goes beyond mother-in-law and daughter-in-law to this deep spiritual, emotional connection and friendship. What else do you glean from this exchange between Naomi, who wants the daughters-in-laws to go back, and the daughter-in-laws who insist on staying with her?
Well, the question I had was the Moabites worshipped idols. And part of Naomi even says to go back and to your own gods. So apparently they did not practice, the two daughters did not practice the Israelite religion because they're being sent back to their own gods,
Mm-hmm.
which is rather.
Oh, we lost somebody. Oh, there she is. She's back. Yeah, and that's going to be an important turn, again, to use that word, when we get into the next couple verses. The claim that Ruth makes about Naomi's God is going to be a contrast to that, for
Yes.
sure. But think about this. I mean, Naomi is not just saying, "Oh, you're better off here." She knows the risk, right? That if these two Moabite women who are widows go with her back to Israel,
Right.
they kind of don't have a chance, right? I mean, they're widows, they have no support system, and they're foreigners. So they've got two strikes against them before they even get back to the land of Israel. So in some ways, Naomi is trying to talk some sense into them and say, you're better off here. There's really no future for you to go to my land at this point. I think Mary Jane was trying to chime in. Mary Jane?
Well, yes, I was just thinking how strong, well, all of these women are, but Naomi is filled with, I think, love for her daughters-in-law, which that doesn't always happen. And I think that's one thing that's very nice and very good, and that they respect her and love her and even want to help her. And but I think it shows how strong Ruth is, especially to have gone from Moab, where she was from, to to Bethlehem, where the Jews were, and they did not like Moabites. So I think it's that she wouldn't go back to her own people and maybe find her own mother or her own family. It shows how very strong she is. And I just think that's really great. It shows an independent woman in the time of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
She struck,
Linda. I'm sorry, Gary.
it really struck me that the way that the women have to relate to one another is always through men. They can only be relating to each other through a husband, a son, a brother-in-law, father-in-law. And so now that there's none of those men left, they really can't have that relationship, or it's not usually recognized that they're in a strong relationship in the community. So that to me was something that kept coming up in what Naomi was saying. And to your point, Doug, about just the reality of where they would be in terms of the community would,
Yeah.
you know, not be in a strong place.
Yeah, that's right. Sherry, were you saying something?
I was going to comment on Ruth's motivations for staying with Naomi, for loyalty and clinging and all that. Maybe I'm not understanding something that was obvious. But I'm impressed by it.
Well, I think that's part of the beauty of the story, right? We don't know her motives explicitly, but clearly something is going on emotionally and spiritually in this relationship. And as Linda said, normally it would be mediated through men. And she would be motivated to stay with Naomi only because, as Naomi said, you know, even if I got pregnant tonight, are you going to wait for this child to grow up? You know, she's trying to kind of, again, talk some sense into them. That I think that's absolutely right, Linda. Naomi's thinking through all the traditional reasons why they would stay, right? Which was around their own protection and safety and security through marriage. But at the end, it's for whatever reason, it's Ruth and her loyalty to Naomi, this woman to woman relationship, which I get is unique. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Ian.
Yeah, the thing that was most striking to me in this passage before and while I was reading it, and this picks up on what Mary Jane was saying, is the genuine, heartfelt, honest affection between these women that
Right.
might have been born of this common tragedy of theirs, but they clearly like each other. They clearly have genuine affection amongst each other, in, more than just the dutiful being the daughter-in-law. And as I was reading through the Hebrew, the words that came out, like, may the Lord deal kindly with you, there's the chesed
Yes.
coming out. It was not in the RSV translation, but when she said, the Lord grant that you may find a home, in the expanded Bible, it says, may the Lord give you to find rest and security, each within the house of her husband. And that word for rest and security I actually wrote down is menucha. And again, it's a word that communicates safety, security, grace, right? So this is about grace. So she's wishing grace on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And notice that there's no real judgment against Orpah, right? I mean, she kisses her mother and the implication is she goes her way, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, I think that for Naomi, that's, so I don't think it's a case of, Ruth choosing the better part. But there's this dramatic departure, right? Orpah sort of follows what would be customary. Yeah, you're right, Naomi. I'm going to go back to my land and my gods and my people. And that sort of highlights the dramatic departure of Ruth's response from sort of cultural norms, social norms, religious norms, etc. So to move on to verses 15 through 18, let me just read these. This is from the English Standard Version. And Naomi said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. And there's that word shuv again. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. And there, that word shuv is again, to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more, right? So Ruth's response, after Naomi's been the primary speaker all through 6 through 14, Ruth lays her case and her commitment before Naomi. And it's striking, isn't it? Right? Your people will be my people. That's kind of a claim that she can't make yet, right? She's asserting herself into this culture and people and ethnic group of which she's not a part. But then the claim, my God, your God will be my God. And that goes back to what Paul said earlier. Orpah goes back to her gods, little g, plural. Ruth makes the declaration that the God of Israel is now going to be her God.
She's very strong. I think she has to be very strong in order to put up with it. I think she has to say she's going to stand there, and whatever happens to her, whatever happens to the two of them, they will be together. But she's making. I was wondering when I'm reading this too, because they make it in the first statement. They say this is the time of the judges. Before the monarchs. This whole thing seems to be more reasonable than most of the books of the Bible in the Old Testament. They seem to be sort of judged by reason and rationale more than most of the other books.
Well, it really is a very human story, right? This is not like Jonah, where you've got, the word of the Lord comes and then he's in a ship that's going to sink and then he gets swallowed by a whale. There's all these extraordinary, out of the box things that's why we read Jonah as satire. This is a very human story, right? This could be any of us, right? Could find ourselves as a character potentially. Well, if we're male, we're all dead in this story. But this happens, right? People go off and get married. Something tragic happens. They go back to their hometown where they're from. I mean, this kind of stuff happens in real life all the time. So it's a very human story that, as you said, is very believable. This you could see this clearly happening in the lives of a family, in the life of a family. Yeah. I wrote in my Bible, change of identity. And I wrote, not this time, at some other time I read this, but it's interesting that for Ruth, this really is a change of who, because she's not being identified by her husband. She's not being identified by her family of origin. She's not being identified by her ethnic group as a Moabite. She is now basically taking on a new identity as an Israelite, and as now the companion of Naomi, which again defies categorization, right? In the ancient world.
She's a born again Judean.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
It feels very cynical to say this out loud, but what keeps running through my mind is, what were her options? What other options did she have versus maybe what Orpah had in her family of origin?
Yeah.
And was that part of, not to belittle the closeness and affection that's talked about between her and Naomi, but it's like maybe she didn't have a lot of options, so I don't know. That's too cynical, but.
Well, but that's what these kinds of stories evoke, I think, when we read them, is there's intentional gaps, and the narrative is very streamlined, I think. So yeah, we don't know anything about Orpah's family of origin or Ruth's family of origin. We know nothing about their support structure and why they got married in the first place, and what they have to go back to. So that's actually, I think, very insightful. All right, will
Mhm.
someone read 19 through 22?
I can.
Go ahead, Linda.
So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has afflicted me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest.
Thank you. So there's just so much in these few verses, right? So they return, the whole town is stirred up because of them. We don't know why, perhaps because they haven't learned that, the three men have died, and there's a response to that. There are three widows coming back, or two widows rather, coming back to the town. And one of them is a Moabite, right? So there's all kinds of reasons why the town is going to be very perhaps agitated, or at least curious about what's going on. What's interesting is Naomi's response, right? So she clearly has found some sense of companionship with Ruth, but she's still in grief, right? She's still grieving. And again, the names are important. Don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant, but call me Mara, which means bitter. And if you are a regular attender of the Stations of the Cross, this particular passage is read, I think it's the 13th station. The body of Jesus is placed in the arms of his mother. And so there's this connection made between the grief of Mary and the grief of Naomi in the book of Ruth. And so it actually says, what is read at the 13th station is, "All you who pass by, behold and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow. My eyes are spent with weeping. My soul is in tumult. My heart is poured out in grief because of the downfall of my people. Do not call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." So it's an interesting liturgical connection. On Good Friday, when Mary receives the body of Jesus, the words of Naomi, at least liturgically, are attributed and connected to her. The last thing to notice that I think is really important is when they return, chapter 1 ends with the beginning of the harvest, right? So if you think of the contrast, at the beginning of chapter 1, Naomi leaves full, but the land is empty. And when she comes back empty, but the land is full, right? So there's this wonderful contrast there between the beginning and the end of chapter 1. And I would encourage you to do the same thing with the book of Ruth that we did with the book of Jonah, which is to pretend like you don't know the rest of the story, and to kind of think at the end of each section or the end of each chapter, what would this story be like if this is all we had, right? This would be a tragedy with the silver lining of this relationship between Ruth and Naomi, right? It could end with them going back and it's the start of the harvest, just like with Jonah, it could have ended with him coming out of the belly of the whale, and that would have been the end of the story. So think about each of these chapters as sort of a scene, if you will, like I said in the introduction, and what would happen if the story ended there, and think theologically about that. Yeah, Kathy? Oh, I thought you were raising your hand.
No, just put them there.
But a lot of wonderful texture to just those last few verses in terms of the symbolism and so forth. And one more thought, the harvest is both sort of the reciprocation of what happens at the beginning of chapter 1, but it's also the setting for the next scene, right? Because that's where Ruth will encounter Boaz, right? So it's the God of the harvest, right? So other thoughts on the ending of chapter 1, or where Naomi and Ruth are at this stage?
I was simply just very sad for her. And that was it. I saw a woman. I saw a woman who was grieving, deep in grief, and walking back into a town where she was being looked at a little askance, like, why are you here, so to speak? And what happened to you? And I just felt very sorry for her, really did. And I know, and she has Ruth, which is someone she can, at this point, lean on if she needs to, but they are together. But anyway, I just felt sad.
And I think that's exactly what we're supposed to feel at the end of chapter 1. Is really this deep identification with Naomi, right? And the pain. Who is in need of redemption at the end of chapter 1? Primarily.
Naomi.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. To Ruth to some extent, but Ruth, still has time on her side in terms of making her way in the world. But Naomi is the one who has suffered this loss. This is her town she's going back to, right? Bethlehem. So in just as Jonah sort of embodied the people of Israel, and his journey in many ways symbolically represented the journey that Israel endured. I think one way to read Ruth is to see the character of Naomi as embodying the need of redemption, the need of grace that the people of Israel needed. So then, who is Boaz? All these, we're getting into these questions, but so Ruth is important, this strong woman who supports Naomi. But at the end of the day, it's Naomi who will have a family restored and will experience redemption at the end of the day.
How are you defining redemption when you ask the question?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same thing.
How are you defining redemption in the use that you're having with your sentence, your question?
That's a great question. I guess I'm defining redemption in terms of the reversal of the misfortune, pain, tragedy that Naomi experiences at the beginning. By the end of the story, there's that has been redeemed, and what was lost has been restored, and she's been saved in the sense that she was heading down a trajectory in which there really was no hope of even survival, and to an extreme sense.
There's no implication of sin or bad behavior, nothing like that. She's not being redeemed from anything negative.
Right.
And that's very important. Redemption is not always about being forgiven or saved from our own sin, right? Redemption, especially in the Old Testament, is a much broader sort of theological category in which God is making right the wrongs of the world and creation. So yes, the exile was a response to Israel's sin and unfaithfulness, but it also was the manifestation of the inherent brokenness of the world, right? And indeed all of creation. So God's vision of redemption is not just individuals sort of being forgiven of their sins, but it is this more holistic idea of healing and making right and making new all things. And I think that's what Naomi sort of represents here. You're right, it's not her fault, but she falls into this place of deep grief and brokenness and tragedy, and separation from her people, and it's through Ruth and Boaz and all of these providential things that Naomi ultimately is the one redeemed at the end of the day. Does that help, Sherry, in some sense?
It does help. I can't help but have my mind go to the present time, where we certainly have a broken world, and we don't have to put blame anywhere in particular, but the world that God is looking at has to be very disappointing to God. And redemption as an intention on God's part, if I can say these things as if God is a person in a sense, it's quite a job to bring about redemption to our world.
Yeah.
Quite a job. And we're on the journey. I know we are. It's just very hard to know that this redemption is working its way.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Yeah, Paul.
I think there is, in the first chapter, there is this clear sign of redemption. Naomi and husband leave Israel because there is a famine. God has, and in that world at that time, God caused the famine.
Mhm.
When they return, they are returning because of the deaths, and in the first chapter they say, and God has come back to Israel and there is now plenty.
Mhm.
So in the story, in the time, there is a classic example of redemption. God has left us, we are being punished, and now good times are back again, and God has returned to us.
Yeah. And it's also what you just described, Paul, is a beautiful example of how the human narrative and sort of divine action parallel each other in the story, right? It's not, again, it's not like Jonah where God is kind of doing everything. It's this very human story that's happening, and then this clear sense of God's providence and direction happening, and they parallel each other through the whole story. And then I think my reading is, the convergence is the genealogy at the end, right? Where those two stories come together is, it's almost, again, if you've never heard the story before and you're just hearing about Ruth and Naomi, you sort of suspend what you know. You get to the end, you're like, oh wow! I mean, the last word of the book is David. So this very human story has brought about this incredible promise for the people of Israel, and that is the good news at the end of the book. So,
Looking at Orpah, Orpah makes the opposite choice. She's turning back to the known, and is not going with the others toward hope.
yeah, that's right. And the mercy that Ruth eventually and Naomi experience, again, goes back to that definition of grace: mercy, not merit. Right? It's not about their ethnicity anymore. It's not about their relationship to the men in their lives. I mean, even we're getting ahead of ourselves, but Boaz, some would say, well, it still takes a man to command. Boaz has to come in, marry her. But that's not my reading at all. I mean, Ruth is in charge of the whole thing, So.
Well, I think Naomi was in charge of the whole thing.
Yeah.
But she is too, yeah.
Yep, that's right.
Today we would call her a woman with agency.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Could I just make a comment?
Yes.
The whole thing about them coming back and there's a stir, I thought about that a lot. And you can imagine in the context of this story, at the very beginning, they left Bethlehem because there was a famine in the land. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine that they were the ones with the means to get out of the hometown when things went bad, when the factory closed, so to speak. And she went away, as she said, full, and now she comes back into town. She's clearly aged by both years and tragedy. And she, instead of being in possession of these strapping young men and a husband, she has this exotic foreign woman with her.
Right,
And you can imagine, it's not too difficult to imagine that, when you hear, is this really Naomi? This sort of thing, and they're making the inquiries. There's a little bit of gloating going on, just like Job's friends gloated over him in his misfortune, because Naomi was probably the one who sort of had it all earlier, and now she's got her just desserts in their minds.
Right.
Which again adds to the tragedy and the fallenness and of her station, and just how even more sad it is.
Yeah. Well, and again, not to oversimplify it, but then if all we have is chapter 1, it's sort of a story of karma, right? Which I said, is the opposite of grace is the opposite of that, right? And that's what's going to play out in the rest of the story, is that it's not about her particular station or position or status, but it's about this inbreaking of God's redemptive purposes into their lives. So that's good. Wow.
Yes, and she took Ruth with her. Naomi took Ruth with her, and that was not a good thing to do, really, because the Jew, when she went back to Bethlehem, they did not like foreign women. So that was just another thing.
Yep.
That maybe is why they were stirred up.
Yeah. Well, we are 22 verses into the book of Ruth, and we've covered a lot of ground already. Chapter 1 is very rich. There's a lot to it. So for next week, read chapter 2, where Ruth meets Boaz. And again, I described these as scenes, and I said to the 11 o'clock group, you might want to think of, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, and the stage goes black, right? And there's all the stage hands rearrange these things, and then the lights come back up, and they're in the field, right? So just think of these movements through the scenes of the story, and it helps you sort of imagine the action taking place. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much. Tonight at 7 o'clock is, Emily.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, we were supposed to be watching, which I did, the service on Sunday with the presiding bishop. Are we ever going to discuss that terrific sermon?
Well, I think it would feed into tonight in some ways. So if you want to bring that up, tonight at 7 o'clock is Faith and Politics, our 3-week Rector's Roundtable on that topic. So
well, I can't be there, but you can, I can't be there tonight, but I can, it's taped, right? And
yeah, we'll record it. We're going to record these sessions and post them on our YouTube page. So yeah.
Doug, how could the presiding bishops, I guess it was a sermon? We didn't see it.
Oh, well, you should
Go
back and see it. It's
it's
required
go to
for
YouTube.
everyone.
I'm going to stop recording here. So thank you all for